Don't you ever think money means you can measure someone's worth? The boy's mother whispered to herself late at night, folding laundry with tired hands. Her voice carried both strength and exhaustion, the kind only single mothers working 2 jobs could understand. Her young son, Jamal, just 12 years old, overheard her words as he sat quietly in the corner, clutching his notebook. He looked at her with wide, innocent eyes and asked softly, "Mama, do you think people like us will ever be treated like we matter?" She paused, her hands trembling, then walked to him and placed her rough but warm palm on his cheek. "Baby, it's not about them treating us right. It's about you never forgetting your own worth. If you know who you are, no one can take that away." These words set the stage for what would happen next, because not far from their small apartment was a mansion that belonged to billionaire Richard Graham. He was powerful, respected, but also proud, too proud. Known for testing the people who worked under him, he believed that trust was earned only through trials, not words. When Jamal's mother, Layla, was hired as a maid in Richard's home, she carried humility with her. She didn't complain, didn't gossip, didn't ask for favors. She just worked, quietly, diligently, with the weight of her child's future pressed against her back every single day. But Richard was skeptical. He didn't trust easily, and though he admired Layla's dedication, he wanted to know what kind of influence she had on her son. In his mind, people revealed their true nature not in front of others, but when they thought no one was watching. So one evening, when Layla was cleaning the grand hall, Richard devised a plan. He invited her to bring Jamal along, telling her, "He can sit in the guest lounge while you finish your work. I don't mind children being here as long as they behave." His voice was calm, but his eyes were searching. This wasn't kindness, it was a test. Later that night, after dinner, Richard sat in his gold-trimmed armchair, pretending to drift into sleep. The chandelier cast long shadows across the room, and Jamal sat quietly at the far end, swinging his legs nervously. Richard cracked his eyelids open just enough to see. He wanted to know. What would this boy do when left alone in a billionaire's living room? Would he snoop, steal, show disrespect? Or would his mother's teachings shape him differently? The silence stretched heavy. Jamal fidgeted, glanced at the shelves lined with antique watches, the marble table holding a wallet and phone Richard had intentionally left out. His young mind wrestled with curiosity. He whispered to himself, thinking no one heard. "Mama says even when no one sees you, God does. And your heart knows." He pressed his palms together, as though steadying himself, and shook his head. Instead of touching anything, he pulled out his small, tattered notebook and began writing. His pencil scratched gently against the paper as he poured his thoughts into words. Richard's heart beat a little faster. He wasn't expecting restraint. He wasn't expecting discipline. Quietly, he listened, then froze as Jamal began speaking aloud to himself, the way children sometimes do. "One day, I'm going to build something with my own hands, not because someone gave it to me, but because I earned it. I want Mama to never work this hard again. She deserves a house where she can rest, not scrub floors. And if I ever get money, I'll remember what it felt like to have none." Richard's eyes widened. There was no greed in the boy's voice, no entitlement, only determination and love. It cut deeper than any speech he had heard from his own wealthy colleagues, people who spent their nights talking about stocks and deals. This was raw, pure, unfiltered hope. He almost broke his act of sleeping, but he forced himself still, wanting to see more. Minutes later, Layla returned to the room, wiping her brow. "Jamal, it's time to go," she said softly. The boy quickly closed his notebook, but before they left, Richard deliberately shifted, pretending to wake. "Oh," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "You're still here? Did my little test bore you?" His words were smooth, but his curiosity was burning. Layla frowned slightly, not understanding what he meant. Jamal simply looked at him with polite respect and said, "Sir, thank you for letting me sit here. You have many things, but the most valuable is that you still have someone to come home to every night. My mama tells me that." The room went silent. Richard's chest tightened. He had all the wealth in the world, but had been alone since his wife passed years ago. No child, no family to share his empire with, and here was this boy, seeing through the glitter and straight into the truth. He cleared his throat, masking his emotions with a dismissive chuckle. "Interesting words for a child. Run along now." But inside, he was shaken. That night, after they left, Richard poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the empty silence of his mansion. The boy's words echoed louder than the ticking of the grandfather clock. "You have many things, but the most valuable is that you still have someone to come home to every night." He looked around at the gold, the marble, the art. None of it filled the space that loneliness carved inside him. And so, unknowingly, a seed had been planted. The billionaire who thought he was testing the maid's son was now the one being tested. Tested by kindness, honesty, and the purity of a child who had nothing but dignity to hold on to. What began as a game of suspicion was slowly turning into a life-changing lesson. The following morning, Richard woke up unsettled. He had wealth, but the boy's words had pierced through his pride like nothing ever had. As he walked past his endless corridors, the silence felt heavier than usual. For years he had surrounded himself with servants who obeyed, employees who flattered, and associates who envied him. But none of them dared to speak truths that a 12-year-old had spoken so innocently. He poured his coffee, but even the taste seemed bitter that morning. By afternoon, Layla arrived again for work, and Jamal came with her. Richard watched from his study window as the boy stepped out of the old bus, clutching that same notebook under his arm. A child who carried dreams in a ragged book, while Richard, with all his resources, often struggled to find meaning in his days. He called for Layla before she began her chores. "Bring your boy to the garden," he said. His voice was firm, but inside he was curious, almost eager. Layla hesitated. "Sir, he won't disturb you. I'll keep him quiet in the lounge." But Richard shook his head. "I said the garden. Let's see what he does outside of four walls." When they walked into the mansion's vast garden, Richard pretended to read a newspaper, reclining in his chair under the sun. He watched carefully as Jamal's eyes widened at the sight of fountains, trimmed hedges, and statues imported from Italy. The boy's sneakers were worn, his shirt faded, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity. He didn't rush to touch anything, didn't ask for toys or treats. Instead, he knelt by a rose bush and traced his fingers along the stem, careful not to break it. Richard lowered his paper and asked, "Do you like it here?" Jamal nodded. "It's beautiful, sir, but it must take a lot of work to keep all of this alive." The billionaire raised an eyebrow. Most children would have said, "Wow, I wish I had this." But this one spoke of the work behind the beauty. "It takes money," Richard replied bluntly. Jamal shook his head, smiling slightly. "Money can buy seeds and soil, but it can't make a rose bloom. Someone has to care for it every day. My mama says anything worth having needs care, not just money." Layla's hands froze against the broom she carried. She glanced at her son, her eyes soft but cautious. Richard noticed, but he said nothing, only observing deeper. He wanted to break the boy, test the limits of his values. So he laid a wallet on the edge of the table, filled with crisp $100 bills, deliberately left half open. Then he leaned back again, closing his eyes, pretending to nap. Minutes passed. The wind rustled the trees, and Jamal sat quietly on the grass. His eyes caught the wallet. He stared at it, his small frame tightening with temptation. He looked back at his mother, but she was sweeping away, not watching. Richard peeked through a crack in his eyelid, waiting. Would the boy's honesty hold? Jamal slowly stood up, walked to the table, and gently closed the wallet shut. But instead of pocketing it, He placed his notebook on top of it, as if to guard it. He whispered to himself, "If it's not yours, you don't touch it." Then he returned to the rosebush, humming a tune his mother often sang while cooking. Richard's chest tightened again. This boy had chances, real chances, to give in to greed, but he didn't. He wasn't perfect. Richard could see hesitation in his eyes, the pull of curiosity. But there was a deeper force at work. A foundation, laid by a mother who had taught him that self-respect was worth more than paper bills. Moments later, Richard deliberately dropped the newspaper, pretending it slipped from his hand. As he bent down to pick it up, he caught Jamal watching him with that same respectful gaze. "You saw my wallet," Richard said in a low voice. Jamal froze, then nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." Richard leaned forward, testing him again. "And yet, you didn't take it. Why?" The boy's answer was simple, but it landed heavy. "Because I want to buy things one day with my own money, not someone else's. If I take from you, it won't feel like mine, and Mama would never smile at me again." His voice cracked a little at the last part, because his mother's smile was his treasure, rarer than diamonds. Layla turned away, pretending to sweep harder, but tears blurred her vision. She had worked years to make sure her son understood dignity, and hearing him say it aloud nearly broke her heart with pride. Richard sat back in silence. For a man who owned empires, he suddenly felt like a student in his own garden, learning lessons from a boy who had nothing but principles. He swallowed hard and forced a laugh. "You talk like you're twice your age. Perhaps you're just trying to impress me." Jamal shook his head firmly. "I don't need to impress anyone, sir. Only myself and my mama." That night when they left, Richard didn't drink. Instead, he sat in his study and stared at the boy's words written on a scrap of paper he had secretly picked up when Jamal dropped a torn page from his notebook in the garden. On it were scribbles of dreams. Build a house for Mama. Buy her new shoes. Give her a rest. Become someone people respect not for money, but for kindness. Richard's hands trembled as he held it. He had never seen his own son's handwriting. He never had a son. And suddenly, the mansion that once made him feel powerful now felt like a cage echoing with emptiness. He realized something unsettling. This boy, this Maid's child, had more wealth in his heart than he had ever possessed in his bank accounts. And Richard, the billionaire who thought he was testing the Maid's son, was now being tested himself. The third evening came quietly, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. Richard had been pacing his study all afternoon, wrestling with thoughts he had buried for years. Something about Jamal unsettled him, yet it wasn't discomfort. It was awakening. For the first time in decades, he questioned the meaning of his success. When Layla and Jamal arrived, Richard requested something unusual. "Bring the boy to the dining hall," he instructed the butler. The table was long enough for 30 guests, yet it had been empty for years. Richard sat at the head, while Jamal sat quietly at the far end, swinging his legs nervously. Layla, confused, stood by the corner, unsure why she had been invited to witness this. Richard cleared his throat. "Tell me, Jamal, if you could have one thing in this room, what would you take?" He expected hesitation, perhaps a childish request for the glittering chandelier or the golden cutlery. But Jamal looked down the long table, then back at his mother. "I'd take the chair next to you, sir, because no one should eat alone." The words fell like thunder in Richard's chest. He froze. His fork slipped against the plate. For years he had filled his home with treasures, but not once had he thought about the empty chairs around his table. His wealth could buy silence, but not companionship. And here was a boy, born into struggle, reminding him of the simplest truth, that life's real richness comes not from possessions, but from people who sit beside you. Richard leaned back, covering his face for a moment as if to hide the storm building inside him. His voice broke when he finally spoke. "Do you know what it means to be wealthy, boy?" Jamal answered without hesitation. Yes, sir. Wealth is when you have someone to share your food with. My mama says money runs out, but love and respect last. The silence was unbearable. Richard looked at Layla, her tired eyes watching him, filled with a humility that shamed his pride. He thought of his late wife, of the empty years since her passing, of the countless nights he drowned himself in business meetings just to avoid facing the truth. And then he thought of Jamal's notebook, those little scribbles of dreams bigger than skyscrapers. Richard's voice cracked as he asked softly, "Boy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Jamal's eyes lit with determination. "I want to be someone who makes people feel seen. I don't care if I'm rich or not. I just want Mama to rest, and I want to prove that where you start doesn't decide where you end." Richard's hands trembled against the polished wood of the table. For the first time in decades, he felt tears press against his eyes. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought I was testing you, but you've been testing me." He walked slowly toward Jamal, each step echoing across the grand hall. His towering figure stopped just before the boy. He lowered himself to one knee, something no servant, no associate had ever seen him do. "Jamal," Richard whispered, his throat tight, "you remind me of everything I lost, and everything I could still be." His hand hovered, then gently rested on the boy's shoulder. For a man who had commanded empires, this simple touch was the heaviest act of surrender. Layla gasped quietly, covering her mouth. She had never seen her employer like this. The billionaire who once looked at her with suspicion now looked at her son as if he were the richest person in the room. Richard stood again, forcing composure, but his voice was softer. "You are more than your circumstances, boy. And you've taught me that I am less than my wealth." He turned to Layla, his tone respectful for the first time. "You have raised him well, better than any fortune could." That night, when they left, Richard remained at the dining table long after. He didn't drink, didn't call anyone. He simply stared at the empty chairs, whispering to himself, "What is a house without laughter? What is wealth without love?" And for the first time, he felt the urge to change, not because he wanted to polish his image, but because a Maid's son had reminded him of what being human truly meant. And so, the billionaire who once pretended to sleep to test a child had been awakened instead. Awakened by truth, by innocence, by a reminder that dignity and kindness were treasures greater than gold. Sometimes the greatest tests in life aren't the ones we set for others, but the ones that life sets for us. And often it is the humble, the overlooked, the ones with the least, who end up teaching us the most. Think about it in your own life. Maybe it's the janitor who holds the door for you, the cashier who smiles even after a long shift, or the child who gives you their last piece of candy. In those small, quiet moments, we are reminded of what really matters. And remember this one closing line. Wealth is not measured by what you keep, but by what you give, and who you become when no one is watching. Friends, if this story touched your heart, don't just keep it to yourself. Subscribe to our channel, Black Saga. Drop a comment below, like the video, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true wealth lies beyond money.